She offered him 5 crumpled dollars and asked, "Where can I buy a heart for my mom?" And in that moment, the billionaire CEO realized he was looking into the eyes of the daughter he never knew he had. Nicholas Rain stood at the front desk of St. Mary's Medical Center, tapping his fingers absently on the polished counter. His suit, a tailored light blue ensemble from a Milan designer, clung neatly to his tall frame. But there was exhaustion in his eyes. He had been running on caffeine and back-to-back business meetings for days, and now he was simply here to collect donation records for his company's medical charity. Just another task in a calendar overflowing with endless obligations. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation, something that always made him uneasy. He reached into his inner pocket for his phone, half listening as the receptionist typed away behind him. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the pediatric wing, followed by the soft beeping of machines from the ICU. That's when he felt it, a small, almost hesitant tug on the sleeve of his jacket. He turned. A little girl stood there, no more than 6 years old, with bright brown eyes and pale blonde hair braided into slightly uneven pigtails. She wore a faded yellow dress, too thin for the air-conditioned hospital, and clutched a crumpled $5 bill tightly in her small hand. Her gaze was direct, innocent, yet too serious for someone so young. "Mister," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you know where I can buy a heart for my mommy?" For a second, Nicholas didn't move. He blinked. The question hit him like a punch in the chest, shattering whatever businesslike armor he had walked in with. He looked down at her again, seeing her properly now, not just as a child, but as someone desperate, someone who had clearly asked this question before and had not yet found an answer. His voice cracked before he could fully speak, the lump rising in his throat too quickly. He crouched down to her level and rested his hand gently over hers. "I can help," he said. "Can you take me to her?" The girl gave a tiny nod and turned, leading him down the hallway without another word. Nicholas followed, his polished shoes making too much noise against the sterile floor. He didn't know why he was following. He didn't know why he felt so instantly responsible for this child. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, not with pity, but with belief, with hope. They passed through long corridors, past curtained rooms and nurses wheeling for poles. She finally stopped in front of a quiet room with dim lighting. A woman lay in the bed, motionless except for the soft rise and fall of her chest. Her skin was pale, lips slightly blue. A heart monitor pulsed steadily beside her, each beep echoing off the walls like a ticking clock. Nicholas stepped inside. The moment he saw her face, his breath caught. It was Emily. His knees went weak, but he held himself upright, gripping the door frame. She looked different, older, thinner, fragile, but unmistakably her. The woman he had loved 6 years ago, the woman he had let go. He hadn't heard from her since the breakup, hadn't known where she went, what had become of her. Now, she lay in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, and standing beside her was a little girl who looked so heartbreakingly familiar. The child turned to him again, her voice now softer than before. "Mommy says not to worry, but I think she's scared." Nicholas felt something inside him collapse. He looked at Emily, then back at the girl. Her face, her eyes, the shape of her mouth, everything in him screamed the truth he hadn't dared consider until now. This was his daughter. Nicholas didn't sleep that night. After leaving the hospital, he had driven aimlessly through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, barely aware of the turns he was taking. The city lights blurred through the windshield, glowing like distant stars behind the thin sheen of tears he refused to let fall. His thoughts raced in loops about the girl, about Emily, about the 6 years he had spent building his empire while never knowing that somewhere his child was growing up without him. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He couldn't erase the image of Emily's lifeless body from his mind, the thin line of her lips, the oxygen mask, the quiet beeping of the machines trying to keep her alive. She had always been full of life, of ideas, of unrelenting fire. Now, she looked like a ghost dot at some point in the early hours. He parked in the lot of a 24-hour diner, but couldn't bring himself to go inside. He sat in the car with the engine running, replaying memories like broken reels. Emily in the sunlight of their tiny New York apartment, paint on her hands and music pouring through cheap speakers. Emily standing in the rain, laughing with her arms wide open. Emily looking at him one last time before walking away, her voice shaking as she said she couldn't be a background figure in his ambition-driven life. He had thrown himself into his company after that, burying the pain beneath. Product launches, board meetings, private jets, and red carpet fundraisers. He'd convinced himself that love was a distraction, that she would be better off without him. And now she was lying in a hospital bed with heart failure. And his daughter was the one asking strangers how to buy a new heart. That morning, Nicholas returned to the hospital, wearing yesterday's clothes and a face far older than it had looked the day before. He requested a private conversation with Emily's lead physician, a tall, quietly intense man named Dr. Grant. They sat down in a consultation room, the fluorescent lighting above them humming faintly. Dr. Grant wasted no time with pleasantries. Emily Murray is in the late stages of heart failure. The damage is extensive. Her heart muscle is deteriorating rapidly, and the medications we've been using are only prolonging the inevitable. Nicholas leaned forward. A transplant, Dr. Grant nodded grimly. But she's not at the top of the list. She's type O negative. That's rare, and even if a donor becomes available, it might be too late. At best, she has maybe 2 weeks. Nicholas ran a hand through his hair. A million strategies already forming in his head. What about private clinics, international registries, anything? Money is not an issue. Dr. Grant sighed. With all due respect, Mr. Rain, this isn't a matter of money, it's about timing. There are legal protocols, ethics boards, and compatibility tests. Even with every door open, the clock is working against her. Nicholas didn't respond immediately. He stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, heart pounding. The truth hit him like cold water. This was something he couldn't simply fix by writing a check. This wasn't a failed merger or a market crash. This was the woman he had once planned to marry, the mother of his child. Slipping away second by second. Later that day, he stood in the hospital garden, watching Lily chase butterflies between flower beds. She ran in crooked lines, her braids bouncing, a small bandage taped over one scraped knee. He sat on the edge of a concrete bench, trying to breathe. She approached him with a yellow dandelion, the kind most people would call a weed, and held it out proudly. "For Mommy," she said. "It's her favorite." Nicholas took it and swallowed hard. "She's very lucky to have you." The girl tilted her head. "Mommy says you're a nice man, but I think you're sad." He looked at her and gave the faintest smile. "I think you're very smart. Are you going to help Mommy?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'm going to try everything." That night, after Lily had gone home with the neighbor who had been watching her during Emily's hospital stay, Nicholas sat by Emily's bedside. She was unconscious, her skin pale against the white pillow. Machines surrounded her, blinking and pulsing, whispering their cold, clinical rhythms. He gently reached for her hand. It was thinner. Then he remembered cold, despite the warm blanket draped over her. He whispered her name. She didn't respond. He thought of the years wasted, the nights they might have spent together, the birthdays missed, the moments gone forever. He had believed he could control everything. But now, with the weight of the past crushing him and the present slipping through his fingers, he realized something terrifying. He had everything a man could want: money, influence, power. But none of it could turn back time. None of it could undo the choices that had led them here. And none of it could guarantee that Emily would survive. As the room darkened and the hallway lights flickered off for the night, Nicholas sat in silence, holding her hand as if willing life back into her. He wasn't sure when the tears finally came, but when they did, they came quietly, steadily, and without shame. Nicholas arrived at the hospital the next morning wearing a clean shirt and blazer. But he felt no different from the man who had wept beside Emily's hospital bed the night before. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, and his stomach churned with a sick mixture of dread and determination. He had spent most of the early hours on video calls with contacts across the globe. Surgeons, directors of transplant networks, even politicians. He had money, he had power, and yet for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. Emily remained unconscious, her condition stable but critical. The medical team had done everything possible to keep her body functioning while they waited for a miracle. Nicholas stood just outside her room, watching through the glass as a nurse adjusted the monitors and scribbled something in her chart. He hadn't said a word to Emily's daughter since yesterday. Not about the past, not about the truth. But the longer he remained silent, the heavier that truth became like a stone in his chest. He found Lily in the small playroom next to the pediatric unit. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing with broken crayons on a paper napkin. Her face lit up when she saw him enter, and she rushed over, holding up the drawing. It was crude, childlike. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a sun with a smiley face. One figure had braids, one had a dress, the third, taller one, wore a blue triangle for a tie. Above them, she had written Mommy, me, and you. Nicholas crouched down slowly and took the picture from her. For a moment, he couldn't speak. You drew this? He asked. She nodded and sat down beside him on the floor. I made it for when Mommy wakes up, so she knows we were here together. His voice almost failed him. That's beautiful. Lily, she looked up at him curiously. You know my name? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I do. Mommy said, you're just a nice man. But you know a lot of things. There was no accusation in her voice, just quiet curiosity. Her innocence made the moment even harder. Nicholas looked down at the drawing. Again, his throat tightening. Lily, he began slowly. I have to tell you something. Something very important. She tilted her head, waiting. You asked me yesterday if I knew where to buy a heart for your mom. I told you I could help, and I will. I'm doing everything I can. I know, she said softly. You're trying really hard. He smiled faintly but pressed on. There's something else. Something your mom never told you. Not because she didn't love you, but because maybe she didn't know how. She waited patiently, her small fingers playing with the hem of her sleeve. I'm your father, Lily. For a moment, there was only silence. Then she blinked slowly, as if absorbing the words one by one. My real daddy. He nodded. Yes, she didn't speak. She just stared at him, as if trying to see something in his face, something that had always been missing. Her hands dropped into her lap. Why weren't you here before? Nicholas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every mistake he'd ever made. Because I didn't know about you. Your mom and we were together a long time ago, but things got complicated. We lost touch. I didn't know she was going to have you. If I had known, I would have been here from the very beginning. Lily looked down at her shoes. She was quiet for what felt like hours. When she finally looked back up, her eyes were shiny with unshed tears, but her voice didn't shake. Are you going to leave again? Nicholas reached out slowly and placed a hand over hers. No, never. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise. Her lower lip trembled. Then, without a word, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. Nicholas held her tightly, his arms encircling her small body as though she might disappear if he let go. He buried his face in her shoulder and let out a shaky breath. They sat like that for several minutes, father and daughter reunited. Not by joy but by necessity and truth. Later, Nicholas spoke with Dr. Grant again and made it official. He signed the documents to be listed as next of kin. He requested to be added to all medical decisions. There was no more pretending, no more walls. That evening, he stood once again by Emily's bedside. He spoke to her, even though she still hadn't woken up, telling her what he had told Lily, telling her he was sorry for everything. He spoke about how proud he was of their daughter, how brave she was, how much she reminded him of her mother. Outside the room, Lily had taped her drawing to the wall. 3 stick figures of family. Nicholas looked at it every time he left the room and felt something begin to mend inside him, something fragile but real. Nicholas had always believed that money could solve most problems. It had opened doors that were locked to others, erased obstacles that would have stopped ordinary people in their tracks, and turned impossible situations into manageable ones. But now, standing in a cold hospital corridor while Emily lay on the edge of life and death, he was beginning to understand the limits of wealth in the face of time. There was no check he could write that would slow the progression of her disease. No bank account large enough to purchase hours that were quickly slipping away. The heart transplant list was long, cold, and bureaucratic. Emily's blood type, O negative, was rare, which made the wait even more difficult, statistically. It could take months. She had weeks, maybe less. The doctors had exhausted all available treatments. Her body was rejecting even the most aggressive medication regimens. At this point, her only chance was a donor heart, and fast. Nicholas activated every resource at his disposal. He placed urgent calls to hospital boards, transplant organizations, and international clinics. Private jets stood ready to fly across borders the moment a heart became available. Anywhere in the world. He reached out to cutting-edge research facilities, asking about experimental treatments and artificial heart programs. He offered millions in donations to fast-track approvals, bypass waiting lists, anything. He spoke to government officials, even quietly approached an embassy or two, looking for diplomatic strings to pull. His assistants coordinated communications across 3 continents, working through time zones with no rest. He had never moved this fast, not even during the most high-stakes moments of his business career. And yet, with every passing hour, the news remained the same. No match, no miracle, no heart. What haunted Nicholas most was the helplessness he saw in Lily's eyes. She stayed close by, sometimes napping in the chair next to her mother's bed, sometimes drawing new pictures that she would tape to the wall like offerings to fate. She asked fewer questions now, as if she sensed how fragile the truth was. When he kissed her forehead or brought her warm meals from the hospital cafeteria, she would smile politely, but the weight in her small shoulders betrayed the fear she was carrying. One afternoon, as Nicholas sat in a glass-walled meeting room with 2 transplant specialists and a liaison from the donor registry, someone mentioned a possible last resort, a revolutionary artificial heart implant that had recently passed clinical trials in Europe. It was a biosynthetic hybrid, part organic tissue grown from the patient's own cells, part nanotech scaffolding that replicated natural heart rhythms. Only one center in Switzerland was performing the procedure, and only a few had survived it. The operation was high risk and had yet to be approved for widespread use in the United States. The room fell silent. As the specialist explained the details, the process was complicated. It would require transporting Emily overseas, likely via a medical jet equipped with a full ICU. They would need to secure international medical permits and sign liability waivers. There was a narrow window in which the surgery could be successful. If she grew any weaker, her body wouldn't survive the flight or the procedure. Nicholas listened, absorbing every word with grim clarity. For the first time, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man holding on to his last thread of hope. He asked the right questions, pressed for timelines, demanded contact information. He told them he would cover every expense, fund the clinic, pay for the next 10 patients after Emily if necessary. Just get her in, get her ready, get her there. After the meeting, he walked slowly through the pediatric garden, where Lily sat under a tree, playing with a worn-out doll. She looked up and gave him a hopeful smile, the kind that pierced straight through him. He sat down beside her and tried to speak gently. "We might be able to help your mom," he said, "but it means taking her far away to a place with very special doctors." Lily listened carefully, then looked at him with wide eyes. "Will you come too?" Nicholas nodded without hesitation. "Of course, we'll both go together." She seemed to consider that for a moment, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was another drawing, this time of an airplane with 3 small figures inside, all smiling. He smiled, though his chest ached. Back upstairs, he watched the team prepare Emily for the possibility of transport. They adjusted her medication levels, began compiling her medical records, and contacted international specialists for consultations. Nicholas signed document after document. He approved a private medical jet outfitted with everything she would need, including an onboard surgical team. There was no margin for error. Everything had to be perfect, and they had 72 hours to make it happen. On the second night, Emily stirred. Briefly, her eyes opened and focused, then fluttered closed again. Her lips moved, whispering something to soft to hear. Nicholas stood beside her, holding her hand, hoping she could feel him there. "I found a way," he said, his voice low, trembling. "Just hold on, Emily, please." He squeezed her hand gently, and for a second, he thought he felt her squeeze back. It was faint, barely more than a twitch, but it was enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to believe. In that moment, Nicholas Rain, billionaire businessman and builder of empires, realized that this was the only deal that truly mattered, and failure was not an option. The night before the flight to Switzerland, the hospital room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of machines monitoring Emily's fragile heartbeat. Nicholas sat beside her, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as though in prayer, though he hadn't prayed in years. The hours had passed slowly, each one weighed down by uncertainty and fear. Lily had fallen asleep in the chair next to her mother's bed, wrapped in a soft blanket one of the nurses had given her. Her small fingers still clutched a crayon drawing she hadn't had the chance to tape on the wall. Emily hadn't spoken since that brief moment 2 nights ago, but the doctors said her condition was stable enough for transport, just barely. The team in Switzerland had confirmed her slot for surgery, and the air ambulance was set to arrive at dawn. All the permits had been approved. The specialists were on standby, and Nicholas had arranged for a secondary surgical team to be flown. And as a precaution, everything was in place, yet he couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety in his gut. He had done everything he could, but that didn't mean it would be enough. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age, edges worn. It was a letter he had written to Emily 6 years ago, but had never sent. He had written it during one of their worst fights, a moment when he'd realized he was about to lose her, but was still too proud or too scared to say what needed to be said. The letter had stayed buried in a drawer until a week ago, when he'd found it while packing for one of his business trips. He had read it over and over since Emily had been hospitalized, each word now feeling both too late and desperately necessary. He unfolded it now and began to read aloud in a quiet voice. Careful not to wake Lily, he told Emily the things he never said when it mattered: how proud he had been of her fearlessness, how much he admired the way she saw beauty in everything, how deeply he regretted putting ambition before love. He read every line, his voice breaking in places. And when he finished, he took her hand gently in his and whispered, "I should have said all of this a long time ago. I should have fought harder for us." The monitors beeped steadily in the background, a fragile reassurance. He didn't know if she could hear him. He didn't know if any part of her was still there behind closed eyes and shallow breaths. But he stayed. All night. He stayed. Just after 3 o'clock in the morning, something changed. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the rhythm of the machines, a sudden urgency in the beeping. The nurse on the night shift noticed it first and rushed into the room, checking the monitors and calling for backup. Nicholas stood instantly, his heart lurching as he saw the numbers drop on the screen. One of the alarms began to wail. Emily's heart rate was erratic, her blood pressure plummeting. A code blue was called overhead. The room exploded into motion. Doctors and nurses poured in, working in swift, practiced rhythm. Nicholas was pushed aside as they began chest compressions. One nurse grabbed a crash cart. Another cut open Emily's hospital gown, placing defibrillator pads across her chest. The lead doctor shouted orders, and the whine of the charging defibrillator filled the air. Nicholas stood frozen in the corner, unable to move, unable to breathe. They shocked her once. Her body arched, no response. They shocked her again. Nothing. Her heart had stopped. Lily stirred in the chair, frightened by the noise, and Nicholas rushed to her, pulling her close as she cried into his chest. He buried her face against him so she wouldn't see what was happening, even as he kept his own eyes locked on the bed. He could barely comprehend the chaos unfolding. It felt like the world was cracking open in front of him. 8 minutes passed before they got a pulse. It was weak, inconsistent, but it was there. The team stabilized her as best they could, hooking her up to additional machines, infusing her with medication, adjusting the respirator. Her skin was pale, her lips nearly colorless, but the faint rise and fall of her chest returned. The room gradually emptied, the lead doctor staying behind to brief Nicholas, who was still holding a trembling Lily in his arms. She flatlined. The doctor said quietly, "We were close to losing her, very close, But she's back for now. We've done everything we can. If we're going to move her, it has to be within the next few hours. No delays. Do you understand? Nicholas nodded, numb. I understand. He sat, with Lily beside the bed until the sun began to rise, holding her tightly while watching Emily sleep, her body now connected to more tubes and wires than ever. The medical flight team was already on site, preparing her for transport. Every second counted. The window was narrow, but it was still open. As they loaded her into the specialized ambulance that would take her to the airport, Nicholas followed, closely, one hand gripping Lily's, the other resting lightly on the edge of the stretcher. Emily's face remained motionless, her body barely reacting as she was lifted and secured into place. Lily looked up at him as the vehicle doors shut. Mommy's going to be okay now, right? Nicholas didn't know how to answer, but he bent down, kissed her forehead, and whispered, she's going to fight, and so are we. The flight to Switzerland was the longest journey Nicholas had ever taken, not because of distance, but because of the unbearable weight of hope and fear that accompanied every second. The air ambulance was outfitted with the most advanced medical technology available, a fully functional intensive care unit in the sky, yet Nicholas couldn't stop glancing at the monitors, unable to trust even the machines that had kept her alive this far. Emily lay unconscious beneath layers of medical blankets, her face pale and still, her body attached to 4 lines, a ventilator, and constant streams of medication. Every beep, every blink of the monitor felt like a ticking clock, a fragile signal that she was still with them, that there was still something left to save. Lily sat beside him with headphones over her ears, watching cartoons on a tablet. Nicholas had insisted on bringing her despite the risks, because leaving her behind had felt wrong. He couldn't bear the thought of Lily waiting in some unfamiliar house, wondering whether her mother was alive. The flight crew had prepared a seat for her with soft pillows and toys, but she barely touched them. She just held Nicholas's hand, in silence for most of the flight, sensing perhaps that this was not an ordinary trip. Her strength humbled him more than anything he had experienced in boardrooms or billion-dollar negotiations. Upon landing, they were met by a medical team from the Zurich Biomedical Institute, led by Dr. Moshe Engel, a specialist in artificial cardiac technology and the surgeon who would perform the operation. He was calm, sharply professional, and moved with a precision that gave Nicholas a sliver of comfort. As Emily was rushed into the hospital through a secured route, Nicholas followed, closely behind with Lily, barely pausing to take in the state-of-the-art facility around him. Everything was white, quiet, and cold in its perfection, like walking into the future. They were placed in a private waiting suite with a view of the nearby mountains, but neither of them noticed. The next hours were a blur of medical preparations, last-minute tests, and critical discussions. Emily's vitals were on the edge of acceptable for surgery. The cardiac arrest she'd experienced just before departure had made the procedure even more dangerous. Dr. Engel did not sugarcoat the risks. The artificial heart was still in experimental stages, and while it had worked in 5 patients so far who had suffered major complications, no one with a preoperative arrest had undergone it yet. This would be a first. Nicholas signed every waiver, every release form, without hesitation. He had made his decision the moment he learned there was a chance to save her. He would rather try and fail than sit in a luxury suite surrounded by missed opportunities and regret. When the surgical team took Emily into the operating theater, Nicholas sat in the hallway with Lily beside him. She didn't cry. Instead, she quietly pulled something from her backpack, a letter she had written on the plane. The paper was crinkled, her handwriting uneven. It said simply, "Dear Mommy, I love you. Please come back to me and Daddy. I want to see you smile again. Love, Lily." She handed it to Nicholas and whispered, "Can you give it to her when she wakes?" Up, he took it carefully, folding it and placing it into the breast pocket of his shirt right over his heart. "I will," he said. First thing, the surgery lasted more than 19 hours. Nicholas didn't sleep, didn't eat. Every hour, a nurse came to update him with cautious optimism, but nothing ever felt certain. Lily slept curled against him on the sofa, and he sat completely still, afraid that any motion might disrupt the balance of whatever fate was unfolding behind those doors. At some point during the early morning hours, Dr. Engel finally appeared. His surgical gown was removed and replaced by a dark blazer. He looked tired, but he was smiling not with relief, but with quiet satisfaction. Nicholas stood before he could say anything. "She made it through the surgery," the doctor said. "The artificial heart is functioning as expected. We'll monitor her closely over the next few days." "But she's alive." Nicholas didn't speak. For a few seconds, he couldn't. His legs nearly gave out beneath him as the storm inside him, the one he had held back for days, finally began to calm. He sat down, put his hands over his face, and breathed for what felt like the first time since this ordeal began later. When they were allowed into the recovery room, Emily lay connected to even more machines. But her new heartbeat was steady, rhythmic, a soft, strong signal of what might finally be possible. Nicholas brought Lily to her bedside, and the little girl placed her drawing beside the bed, without saying a word. Then she looked up at Nicholas. "She's not smiling yet," she said. "She will," Nicholas replied gently, brushing a strand of hair away from Emily's forehead. "She just needs time." Lily nodded, her small hand resting on the edge of the blanket. Nicholas sat beside her, watching the steady rise and fall of Emily's chest, feeling that for the first time in years, the world had stopped pulling him away from what truly mattered. The mountain sunrise filtered through the window behind them, painting the walls in gold and pale pink. It felt like the beginning of something they had once lost and were just now finding again. The first 72 hours after the operation were the most critical, and they passed like an endless fog of worry, whispered updates, and silent prayers. Emily remained unconscious for the first day, her body adjusting to the foreign rhythm of the artificial heart beating steadily within her chest. Doctors came and went quietly, checking machines, reviewing charts, speaking to each other in hushed tones that only increased Nicholas's anxiety. He refused to leave the hospital, choosing instead to stay in the small room adjacent to the ICU where Lily and he had been given space. The walls were white and cold, the air to clean, and time moved without mercy. On the second day, Emily stirred. It was subtle at first, a twitch in her fingers, a shift in her breathing, but Nicholas noticed it immediately. He stood so abruptly from the chair that he nearly knocked it over. When her eyelids fluttered and finally lifted, revealing the familiar shade of deep hazel beneath them, he felt something break wide open in his chest. She blinked slowly, confused, her lips moving as she tried to form words. He leaned in gently, taking her hand. "You're safe," he said, barely able to keep his voice steady. "You're here, and you made it." Her eyes filled with tears before she could even respond, but her fingers tightened around his. It was weak, trembling, but it was real. A nurse quickly entered the room as the monitors detected her change in vitals, and within seconds, the space filled with cautious energy as the medical team confirmed she was responsive and stable. Dr. Engel arrived minutes later and gave a rare, genuine smile. "It's early," he said to Nicholas, "but this is what we hoped for. She's strong." Emily was too weak to speak much that day, but her eyes did all the talking. When she saw Lily enter the room, her tears returned in full. The little girl ran to her side, carefully hugging her as best she could, with the tubes and wires still in place. Emily whispered her name over and over again, as though simply repeating it could anchor her back to life. Nicholas didn't try to explain everything right away. Instead, he focused on being present. He helped her sip water, sat with her through every test, and made sure Lily was cared for and not overwhelmed. When the doctors confirmed that Emily was strong enough to be moved to a private recovery room, Nicholas personally oversaw the transition, ensuring every detail from the temperature to the sunlight exposure was perfect. Over the next few days, Emily regained more strength. Her speech returned slowly, and though her body was still frail, her spirit was unmistakably intact. One evening, just before sunset, she asked Nicholas to sit beside her when Lily had fallen asleep. "I thought I was going to die," she said softly, her voice still raw but stronger than before. "I felt myself leaving, like everything was slipping away, and I was too tired to hold on." Nicholas reached for her hand, But you did hold on. You fought. She studied his face for a long time. Why? Did you come? He didn't look away. Because I never stopped loving you. And because I had no idea you were carrying part of me all this time. Her expression softened with emotion, but there was still pain in her eyes. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to tie you down. I thought you'd moved on. You had everything, your company, your success. I didn't think there was room in your world for me anymore. Nicholas exhaled slowly. I thought I was doing the right thing by letting you go back then. I told myself love was a distraction, that ambition had to come first. I was wrong. Nothing I've built means anything compared to what I almost lost. Emily looked away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I raised her alone, and there were nights when I hated you for not being there. But I never stopped hoping you would come back someday, even when I told myself I didn't need you. He nodded. I didn't deserve that hope, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in days, a quiet peace settled between them. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of healing. 2 weeks passed, and with each day, Emily improved. Her body adapted to the artificial heart better than the doctors had dared to expect. Physical therapy began, early slow steps, guided by a gentle nurse who reminded her every time that every movement was progress. Nicholas stayed through it all, helping her walk, cheering her on, learning how to care for the device inside her. During this time, he and Lily grew closer in ways he hadn't imagined possible. They shared breakfasts in the hospital cafe, took walks around the nearby lake when Emily rested, and even played board games on the floor of the recovery room. Lily had stopped asking if her mom would be okay. Now, she asked when they could go home together. On the day Emily was finally cleared to leave the hospital, Nicholas arranged a quiet celebration. No press, no entourage, just the three of them and a nurse who had grown fond of their little family. They walked out of the front doors slowly, sunlight warming their faces. Emily leaned lightly on Nicholas's arm as Lily skipped ahead, pointing out birds and flowers as though the world had suddenly become new again. That night, back at the apartment Nicholas had rented for their stay, Emily sat on the balcony, wrapped in a soft shawl, the stars above them brighter than they'd been in months. Nicholas joined her, bringing 2 mugs of tea. She turned to him and said, I don't know what comes next, but I want you in it. And with that, the last wall between them came down, not because everything had been healed, but because everything that mattered had finally been spoken. 6 months passed, and life slowly began to resemble something whole again. The recovery wasn't quick or easy, but it was real. Emily adjusted to her new reality with a quiet resilience that reminded Nicholas of the woman he had fallen in love with years ago. There were difficult days, moments of pain and exhaustion, times when fear returned like a shadow behind her eyes, but each time she faced it with grace. Physical therapy became a part of her daily life, and with time, her strength returned. The artificial heart, this quiet, tireless machine, beat inside her not just as a symbol of survival, but of second chances. They returned to Los Angeles in early spring. Nicholas had found them a quiet house in the hills, not far from the city, surrounded by trees and sunlight. It wasn't grand or showy like the penthouses he used to occupy, but it was warm, open, and real. He had left much of his company in the hands of a trusted executive team, stepping back from the endless demands of corporate life to focus on the family he had once unknowingly abandoned. For the first time in his adult life, his phone no longer dictated his every move. He had something far more important to protect. Now Lily thrived. School became her new adventure, and she adjusted to the idea of having both a mom and a dad with a kind of natural acceptance only children possess. She drew pictures almost every day, and they now covered the refrigerator, the hallway walls, and even the side of the bookshelf. Most of them featured 3 figures: a tall man, a woman with a heart on her shirt, and a girl with 2 long braids. Sometimes there was a cat, which they didn't have yet, but she insisted it was only a matter of time. One evening, after Lily had gone to sleep, Nicholas and Emily sat together in the living room, the glow from the fireplace casting soft shadows across the walls. She rested her head against his shoulder, a blanket wrapped around her legs. The hum of the artificial heart was nearly inaudible. but Nicholas could feel its presence, a gentle rhythm under his fingertips whenever he held her hand or touched her back. He never stopped being aware of it, not in fear, but in gratitude. That sound meant she was still here. They talked more openly now than they ever had in the past about their years apart, the pain of missed milestones, and the strange, beautiful way life had brought them full circle. Emily told him she had begun painting again, slowly at first, then obsessively. She had started a new series, a collection she called Resilience, and Nicholas had quietly purchased a small gallery space where she could showcase them. Should she ever want to, she said she might not, for fame or attention, but because she had something worth sharing now. By early summer, Nicholas began to plan something he had only ever imagined before, a wedding. Not a lavish affair with flashbulbs and designer menus, but something intimate and rooted in love. He proposed on a quiet morning with no audience except the birds outside the kitchen window. He didn't kneel. He simply held her hands and said, "I don't want to miss any more of this, not one more minute. Will you marry me?" She nodded, crying and laughing at the same time, and pulled him into the kind of kiss that didn't need words. They were married 2 months later in the backyard of their home. The garden was in bloom, the sky clear and soft with golden light. Only a few close friends were invited, along with the medical team from Switzerland who flew in just for the occasion. Dr. Engel gave a short, unexpected toast during dinner. "We deal in science," he said, raising his glass, "but every once in a while, what saves someone isn't medicine, it's love." Emily smiled at that, and Nicholas reached for her hand under the table. Lily stood between them during the ceremony, holding a small basket of rose petals. When the officiant asked, "Who gives away the bride?" Lily raised her hand high and said loud enough for every guest to hear, "I do." Because Daddy didn't buy Mommy a heart, he gave her his. A hush fell over the yard, followed by the soft sound of laughter and tears. Nicholas bent down and hugged her tightly, burying his face in her shoulder, not caring who saw. Emily was crying too. That moment, so innocent, so pure, was more sacred than any vow they exchanged. Later, as the sun set and guests danced beneath the strings of lights Nicholas had hung the day before, Emily pulled him aside and whispered, "We're not just starting over, you know. We're writing something entirely new." He nodded, "And it's the best thing I've ever helped build." They stood there for a long while, just watching Lily dance barefoot in the grass, her laughter ringing through the warm air. The past still existed. It always would, but it no longer held them hostage. It was now simply the road that led them here to a life neither of them had planned, but both of them had chosen. And through it all, in the quiet space between one heartbeat and the next, Nicholas understood what it meant to truly be alive. Not because of wealth or victory or recognition, but because the two people who mattered most were beside him, breathing the same air, sharing the same future. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the ones we pray for. They're the ones we never believed we deserved but receive anyway. Asterisk.